Fantasy Flight Games going out of business. Now, that is not clickbait. Kind of. Maybe. But not really. This idea that recently, about 4 or 5 days ago, I've been kind of following it and looking at some different scenarios and talking to some other friends, that Fantasy Flight has now not really lost. They've had some licensing shift around. The idea is X-Wing miniatures, all of their miniature-based stuff, the Star Wars type stuff is now switching to another studio. And Fantasy Flight's evolution over the years, the very thing that has made them profitable at the expense of everything else, has now been taken away. So what is really left for this company? Is it kind of being dismantled, farmed, and parceled out? That is the question. So if we back up and look at before they became acquired and when they were first starting out, the idea was they had to develop their IP, their properties in-house. You know, if we look at games like Descent and Terranoth and Runebound, well, Terranoth, the universe, and titles from that projection, a lot of their games they owned. They owned the rights. They became very, very popular. Now, they also picked up a couple of Games Workshop titles, Talisman, other titles back in the day that nothing else was being produced, and injecting that with their own artwork and their own flavor. That increased the profitability, and if you've been following my channel, you know I love Talisman, and it was a great chance to acquire the complete set over the years. Before that, you either had to buy an older set or possibly pick up, I think it was 2007, 2008, the Black Library edition, but that didn't have any of the small box expansions or the different corner type expansions or the Dragon. So there was a lot that opened up, but we started to see the shift of Fantasy Flight, 50% their own IP, 50% taking Games Workshop board games. There were a couple of miniatures in the component, but they were not miniature games. So they were not in direct competition or conflict with Games Workshop. But then things shifted with X-Wing miniatures and the idea of not only competing against Games Workshop, and for a number of years before GW got their act together, X-Wing miniatures actually ranking number one. X-Wing miniatures just, actually destroying 40K, the giant in the room, so to speak. But we also started to see them pick up titles and implement titles. Marvel, we saw them pick up titles regarding Lord of the Rings. I mean, they still have the board game, they still have the card game, and they kind of jumped into their own version, but also IP and other properties of role-playing games. Now, that kind of made sense, the role-playing games, because from my own perspective, it might not be different than yours. I primarily play war games. Battletech, Warhammer 40K, Historicals, Wings of Glory. And when I can't do the wargaming thing, I tend to play board games solo. Although, I do play with a board gaming group. But the idea was, what got me into board games was, well, if I can't play war games, because I don't have any friends around right now, and it's late in the morning, then I'll play some board games till I can get to play some war games. But parallel to that, very strong, parallel to that, role-playing games, Dungeons & Dragons, Paranoia, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the past year plus, Alien the RPG, loving it, absolutely fantastic. This parallel track, and I would think that is the same for many in the community, in the hobby. Tabletop games that you play, miniature or board, you probably play role-playing games. So if you liked Runebound, if you liked Terranoth, if you like some of the IP of Fantasy Flight, you're going to check out their role-playing games. They do implement some interesting mechanics. This is heresy right now, but I stand by my words. I loved Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, their implementation of the custom dice and how to utilize it. I mean, fantastic. Yes, it broke from the percentile system, and systems picked up by Dark Heresy. Well, Dark Heresy was another great title from that perspective. But in pushing that out, that was I don't want to say fun money, but that was a little bit of extra cash on the side for them. Their main push was the board games. But then we started to see the scaling back, scale back on Descent, cut back on Runebound, discontinue non-Terranoth titles, Games Workshop pulled away their titles because they're like, you guys are making too much money. We could just keep it all. We're just going to keep all the cash. And Fantasy Flight was existing on that smaller footprint pyramid. They still had some big titles. Well, now you take away X-Wing miniatures. And for me, the big shift was, and I could be wrong, 2.0. I play 2.0. I play 1.0. I play mostly 1.0 because I prefer it. We don't need to get into those reasons now. But I play it competitively, 2.0 competitively, tournaments, 1.0 just narrative, throwing down the stuff, see what sticks. The big thing was you had a massive base of 1.0 ships, and you essentially pulled the usual Fantasy Flight, which we knew was coming. Fantasy Flight is Descent First Edition, Second Edition. It's not Third Edition, but it really is Third Edition. Runebound Second, Runebound Third, Battlelore 1, Battlelore 2. You see this where they force you to rebuy. Now, they do implement the rules a little differently. They do upgrade things, but you couldn't pull that on X-Wing 1.0. I mean, the amount of 1.0 stuff that I have, if Mrs. Fritz ever really knew or ever really found out, like that would be it. I'd have to like move in with one of my subscribers here because it would just be out of control with that reality on there. So that was big to look at, where it's like, wait, I'm going to spend like $300 on new cards to play stuff I already own? No. And then I understand some of the implementations in 2.0. I get where they were going, but it didn't fix the game. It did not fix the game. X-Wing 1.0 is a lot like 40K. It's not competitive. The rules are broken. You can't approach it from that competitive play. You have to approach it from narrative. The whole thing just falls apart and blows up. That took a huge hit. I know they've seen a huge hit in their profit line from that. So now the powers that be, the kind of monolithic behind the scene company that shall not be named, they're seeing the board gaming industry, board gaming trends. They got those Gordon Gekko-like figures there that are just like, I don't care about the hobby. I don't care about the community. I don't care about the developers that have put that time in. You could see this sunset. It's beautiful, right? They're looking to just farm that cash. So they're just looking and saying, let's acquire this and let's just absolutely market it. And let's just take it over. We saw this where if your game is missing a piece or messed up, we're not fixing it. Too bad. Go to the place you bought the board game. They're not going to eat that. So we've seen a cascade of a number of policies that have strip mined and put that profit first. I mean, it makes Games Workshop look like your grandmother baking you cookies who loves you. So from that perspective, this idea of Fantasy Flight losing that profit, losing that edge, switching channels, that's not realignment. That's giving it to studios that could market it out. Well, if you take away X-Wing, if you take away the superpower stuff, you've absolutely killed the RPG section. What does that leave you with? You're back to board games. Well, that was fine 2006, 2008 Fantasy Flight games when, they were in a studio and like just an unheated warehouse. But to deal with the bloat of that organization now and the employees and the game designers, you're not going to need that many. You're not. And I really have to wonder if Fantasy Flight is losing the innovation behind the mechanics as opposed to the bling. And I'm holding my breath. Got to end this rant a little bit, but I'm holding my breath with Descent 3.0. And I know it's not 3.0, but let's just be honest. It is 3.0 because we're trying not to fool the 2.0 people to rebuy 3.0. Put the artwork aside. Okay, that's a matter of perspective, but I like where we're going with the 3D terrain. I understand what they're trying to do. Not a big fan of the app, but I'm not really seeing that many innovative mechanics. It's too risky to innovate mechanics. You need something that's passable that you can just farm out. As soon as they killed Legacy of Dragonhold, I knew that. That developer, she was a genius, and that was so bold and ambitious to take the simplicity of a choose-your-own-adventure type book, turn it into a living gaming world, RPG, multiple paths. I mean, you play that game, and it feels like you're in a living universe. That the innovation, the daring, the risk, that was supposed to be a whole new system, the Oracle system. Where'd that go? Where's my like part 2 Dragonhold? Where's my expansions? Like, that game is amazing. It's one of the gems in my collection. More replayability than you think, even for a choose your own type adventure. It's fantastic. Not app driven, old school, production value great, looks great, works great. It's kind of like Tales of the Arabian Nights updated, although less random and like getting turned into random stuff. But once they drop that so fast and you can see the strip mining going on, I just think it's a tough place to be. Am I being too harsh? Am I being too critical? Possibly. I'm on a lot of caffeine right now because I'm trying to paint through my God tier stuff and get that done because I'm loving God tier. And it just demands to be painted, but at the same time I need to play it. So I'm working on that. I'm pretty power drinked up, fueled up. But I'm just kind of looking and saying, you know, if you're going to strip Fantasy Flight down to the board games and you're not going to innovate for those titles to stand out when there is so much that stands out right now, I can't see the footprint of the studio existing at that. You know, it's still going to have a place. It's still going to contribute to the bottom line, but not the powerhouse that it currently is. I can't see it existing at that. But that's just seeing a little bit. I mean, there might be bigger plans. There might be other plans. There might be a complete pivot. I will say that. But they're switching away from miniatures back to a board gaming company.